More than 3,000 years ago, in the most powerful empire of the ancient world, a woman did something no one believed was possible. She sat on the throne of the pharaohs, wore the double crown, symbolizing supreme power, and ruled Egypt for 21 consecutive years, from 1479 to 1158 BCE. Not as a queen consort, nor as a regent. She was Pharaoh, a ruler chosen by the gods themselves, head of the largest empire on earth at that time. Throughout her 21-year reign, she led an expedition across the ocean to a mysterious land the Egyptians called Punt, bringing back plants and fragrances never before seen in Egypt. She raised 2 obelisks, the tallest stone columns in the world at that time, their tips gilded with gold, so the reflected light could be seen from dozens of miles away. And she built a temple so refined that even modern architects, standing before it for the first time, still cannot fully explain how an ancient civilization achieved such precision. But here is what is truly strange. After she died, someone took a chisel and hammer, patiently carving away her name from hundreds of monuments across Egypt, scraping each stone slab clean. Her face was smashed, her image was chiseled away, her name was struck from the official list of kings, as if she had never existed. 21 years of rule, nearly erased completely in just a few years. Why? Who did this? So what really happened in the final years of her reign? If you're curious about these questions, leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I'm really excited about this. She led her country through an era of glory, but what ending awaited this female pharaoh? Now, let me help you analyze that story at the deepest level, starting from the very place where it all began. Around 1507 BCE, in the radiant city of Thebes on the banks of the Nile, a child was born inside the royal palace. Her father was Thutmose I, the pharaoh ruling Egypt at the height of the new kingdom. Her mother was Queen Ahmose, the principal wife who carried the oldest royal bloodline of the dynasty. She was named Hatshepsut, meaning foremost of noble women. That was not simply a beautiful name, it was a declaration. Thebes at that time was the center of power in the ancient world. The Temple of Karnak was endlessly expanding. Boats loaded with gold and ivory from Nubia docked every day, and the chanting of priests echoed from early morning until late into the night. Hatshepsut grew up amid all of that splendor, but she also quickly realized that the world of the court held no equal place for daughters, no matter how noble their blood. Her half-brothers were trained in archery, taught to drive chariots, and prepared to become military commanders. As the eldest daughter of the principal wife, Hatshepsut was trained to become the wife of a future king. She took this education very seriously. She learned hieroglyphic writing early, mastered the rituals of the temples, and watched every movement within the court with eyes sharper than anyone around her. At royal banquets, she sat listening to senior officials debate matters of state, trade, and military campaigns in Nubia and the Levant. She missed nothing. Her father, Thutmose I, was the first to notice this in her. Surviving inscriptions from this period show that he brought Hatshepsut to participate in several important royal ceremonies, something extremely rare for an Egyptian princess. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he sensed that this daughter was different from what the court expected. But even Thutmose I, one of the greatest pharaohs of the kingdom, could not have imagined what was about to happen. Because when a king begins to grow old, he leaves behind more than a kingdom. He leaves behind a question the entire court must find a way to answer. Who will be the next to sit upon this throne? As Hatshepsut grew older, Thutmose also grew old, and his health began to decline. He was forced to confront that question sooner than he wished. Like every Egyptian king before his passing, he had to arrange for the future of the kingdom. and he made a decision steeped in political calculation. He named his son by a secondary wife, a young man also called Thutmose, as heir to the throne. But an heir who did not carry the blood of the principal queen would always face questions about his legitimacy. To resolve that problem and preserve the sacred bloodline within a single family, Thutmose I arranged a marriage between his son and Hatshepsut herself, the daughter who carried the purest royal blood. Marriage between half-siblings was customary in the Egyptian royal family at the time, not out of a lack of options, but because it was the way to keep the sacred bloodline from being diluted by other families. Hatshepsut became Great Royal Wife, the highest title a king's consort could hold. It was a position respected by all of society, but also one with very clearly defined limits on real power. Not long after, Thutmose I passed away, and Thutmose II ascended the throne exactly as planned. But his reign, lasting about 15 years, was never as strong as his father's had been. Archaeologists who later examined the mummy of Thutmose II found numerous signs of chronic illness on the skin and surviving tissue, suggesting his health was quite weak throughout his reign. While her husband grew increasingly weak, Hatshepsut quietly took on more and more responsibility in the affairs of the court, without receiving any formal recognition for it. The couple had one daughter, named Neferure, whom Hatshepsut would later train and prepare for the most important roles within the royal court. Thutmose II also had a son by a secondary wife, also named Thutmose, who would later become Thutmose III. When Thutmose II died around 1479 BCE, Thutmose III was far too young to rule on his own, and Hatshepsut, as Great Royal Wife and the person with the longest standing service in the entire palace, stepped forward to fill that vacuum of power. She became regent. In theory, and according to Egyptian tradition, that role was only temporary, one that would end when Thutmose III came of age. But what Hatshepsut would do in the years that followed shows that she never understood temporary the way everyone around her expected her to. In the early years of her reign, Hatshepsut ruled properly and strictly, according to the protocol her position allowed. She appeared at ceremonies as the representative of the young pharaoh, handled matters of state, and oversaw the operations of temples across the country. But around the 7th year of her reign, something completely changed the situation. No one knows exactly what happened in the decision-making chambers of the Theban palace at that time. There is no record of any conversation, no decree explaining the decision, only the result. Hatshepsut declared herself Pharaoh of Egypt, not queen consort, not regent, but Pharaoh. From wearing the flowing white robes of an Egyptian queen, Hatshepsut gradually transformed her public image into that of a true pharaoh, appearing with the striped Nemes headdress, the sacred beard of Osiris, and the royal shendit kilt that Egyptian kings traditionally wore. She assumed all 5 official titles of an Egyptian pharaoh, including Son of Ra and Madet Kere. Truth is the soul of Ra. She wore the double crown, the symbol of rule, over both Upper and Lower Egypt. She carried the royal crook and flail, the 2 supreme emblems of pharaonic power. And most significantly of all, she was depicted in sculpture and painting in the form of a male pharaoh, complete with the traditional golden false beard, the shendit kilt, and a body rendered according to the conventions reserved for male kings. This was not deception. This was the language of power. In ancient Egyptian society, the image of the pharaoh was a sacred image shaped by thousands of years of symbolism. The pharaoh was Horus on earth, the son of Ra, the pillar of Ma'at, the cosmic order on which the entire civilization depended for its survival. All of those symbols, across thousands of years, had become completely bound to the male form. So if Hatshepsut wanted to be recognized as a true pharaoh, not as some temporary arrangement, she had to fully step into that sacred mold. And she did so, perfectly, and with calculated precision in every detail. But adopting the image of a male pharaoh was only the first step in a far larger strategy. Hatshepsut understood that symbolism alone was not enough. She needed to build a genuine network of power, loyal people, political alliances, and a story of legitimacy strong enough that no one in the court would dare question it. And the first person she turned to, the one who would become her indispensable right hand for the rest of her reign, had already been at her side long before she took the throne. His name was Senenmut. He came from a completely ordinary family in the region of Armont, near Thebes, with no noble lineage, no priestly office anywhere in his family. According to archaeological evidence found in the tomb of his parents, the Senenmut family belonged to the common class, with nothing foretelling the extraordinary future awaiting their son. Senenmut began his career in the royal administration during the reign of Thutmose II, Hatshepsut's husband, working in modest administrative positions. But once Hatshepsut became regent, and then declared herself pharaoh, Senenmut's career accelerated at a pace never before seen in the history of the Egyptian court. He was appointed steward of the god's wife, a religious title tied directly and personally to Hatshepsut. He became the private tutor of Princess Neferure, her only daughter, a position requiring the absolute trust of the mother pharaoh herself. And most importantly, he was appointed overseer of royal works, responsible for designing and supervising every major construction project of Hatshepsut's reign. At the height of his career, Senenmut held nearly 90 different titles and offices, spanning the administrative, religious, and architectural fields of the entire country. This was not random favoritism. It was a deliberate political strategy. Hatshepsut, as a woman challenging the entire patriarchal tradition of the pharaonic institution, could not rely solely on the old nobility, people who might remain loyal to the traditional royal bloodline rather than to her personally. By elevating a commoner like Senenmut to the highest positions of power, she created an entirely new class of officials who were loyal only to her, because their careers and status were directly tied to the survival of her reign. This was one of the most sophisticated political maneuvers any pharaoh, male or female, ever carried out in Egyptian history. The relationship between Senenmut and Hatshepsut, because of this unusual closeness, became one of the most fascinating mysteries of ancient Egyptian history. There are graffiti drawings from that era, found in residential districts near Thebes, depicting a suggestive scene between a pharaoh figure and a man, which many researchers speculate alludes to Hatshepsut and Senenmut. But graffiti is the language of common people, not necessarily a reflection of the truth inside the palace. What is far more certain is the extraordinary degree of influence Senenmut held, and the fact that Hatshepsut trusted him almost completely for decades. That very trust laid the foundation for the next great achievement of her reign. Because the man Hatshepsut, entrusted with designing her greatest monuments, was the very same man she sent to organize the expedition that would forever change how the world perceived her power. But there is a mystery even deeper than this relationship, one modern Egyptologists still cannot fully explain. Sometime around the 16th to 18th year of Hatshepsut's reign, the name Senenmut abruptly vanishes from every court record. No one knows how he died. No one knows where he was in his final years. The tomb he built for himself near Deir el-Bahari, a monument that should have been magnificent, was left unfinished when it was discovered centuries later. The sudden disappearance of the second most powerful man in the kingdom, at the very height of Hatshepsut's reign, is one of the many questions she left behind for history, without an answer. If Senenmut laid the foundation for Hatshepsut's power within the court, he was also the one entrusted with turning her ambition into an achievement that astonished the entire ancient world. Around the 9th year of her reign, Hatshepsut decided to do something very few pharaohs before her had dared attempt on such a scale. She organized a major trade expedition to the mysterious land the Egyptians called Punt. This was not an impulsive decision. It was a carefully calculated political move, designed to prove to the entire court and the whole kingdom that her rule brought genuine prosperity, not merely titles and symbols carved in stone. 5 large ships, fully equipped and loaded with Egyptian goods, crossed the Red Sea heading southeast. No one today knows exactly where Punt was located. Modern scholars debate between the Horn of Africa, present-day Somalia and Eritrea, or the southern Arabian Peninsula. But wherever it was, this was a land the Egyptians had known since the Old Kingdom and regarded as the land of the gods, the source of the most sacred fragrances used in their most important religious rituals. The expedition returned with an almost unbelievable amount of cargo. 31 living incense trees, dug up whole, their roots carefully wrapped in soil, then transported by ship across the sea back to Egypt, a logistical feat never before recorded. Along with this came gold, fragrant resins, ebony wood, ivory, animal hides, and exotic animals never before seen in Egypt. Hatshepsut had this entire journey carved onto the walls of her temple with astonishing detail, turning a maritime trade voyage into an eternal political statement. One can still see the shapes of the Egyptian ships, images of the people of Punt, with their houses built on stilts, and especially the portrait of the Queen of Punt, Ati, depicted with unusual bodily features that modern researchers believe may be linked to a specific medical condition. This was the first time in recorded history that a national leader organized and documented a trade expedition with this level of detail. Not to boast of a military victory, not to record scenes of conquest and plunder, as most other pharaohs did, but to record a peaceful encounter between two cultures, a trade exchange beneficial to both sides. And this is precisely the key to Hatshepsut's strategy of rule. While most Egyptian pharaohs built their legitimacy through military conquest, she chose an entirely different path. She proved her power through wealth, through stability, and through the ability to expand Egypt's influence through diplomacy and trade rather than war. This was not because she lacked military capability. As the next chapter will show, she lacked it not at all. This was a deliberate choice, a redefinition of what it meant to be a great pharaoh. The wealth gained from the Punt expedition did not simply sit idle in the royal treasury. Hatshepsut poured those resources into a building campaign of unprecedented scale, making her one of the most prolific builders in the entire history of ancient Egypt. At the Temple of Karnak, she raised 2 obelisks 30 meters tall, the tallest stone columns in the world at the time, their tips covered in an alloy of gold and silver called electrum to reflect sunlight visible from many miles outside the city of Thebes. Quarrying, transporting, and erecting those 2 massive blocks of granite, personally overseen by Senenmut, was an engineering feat that modern engineers are still studying to understand how the ancient Egyptians achieved it. But the greatest monument, the one that even 3,000 years later still leaves anyone standing before it breathless, is the Temple of Deir el-Bahari. The Egyptians called it Djeser Djeseru, meaning Holy of Holies. Designed by Senenmut and by Hatshepsut herself, this temple was built directly beneath the magnificent white limestone cliffs of the Theban West Bank. 3 consecutive terraces, lined with massive colonnades, each level connected by long, gentle ramps, creating an architectural effect never before seen in Egyptian history. But this temple was not merely a work of art. It was also a political instrument, carefully designed to answer the question Hatshepsut knew people would always ask about her. Inside, the walls are covered with reliefs, telling the story of Hatshepsut's divine origin. According to the story carved on these walls, the god Amun took the form of Thutmose I and came to her mother, Queen Ahmose, conceiving a child who carried divine blood directly from Egypt's supreme god. This was a story every Egyptian pharaoh needed to legitimize their rule, but Hatshepsut told it with unusual detail and extraordinary persuasive force, because she needed it more than anyone who had ever sat upon the Egyptian throne. Alongside this, she also had the entire Punt expedition carved onto these same walls, placing her economic achievement directly beside her claim to divine bloodline. Two pillars, reinforcing one another to support her legitimacy. She also had her formal coronation scene carved into the walls. The moment the god Amun directly recognizes her as the rightful heir to the throne. Once again emphasizing that this was not a seizure of power, but the will of the gods themselves. She was not building only for herself. She was building an argument, a declaration, an answer to the question she knew people would forever ask. Why does a woman have the right to sit upon the throne of the pharaohs? And her answer, carved into limestone to endure across millennia, was, because the gods themselves chose me. And these monuments, these expeditions, this prosperity, are the living proof of it. While building this story of legitimacy, Hatshepsut also did not neglect another crucial element of power, the military. She kept Thutmose III at her side as co-pharaoh throughout her reign. But rather than pushing him aside entirely, she granted him command of the army from a very young age. Throughout those years, Thutmose III repeatedly led troops into battle and accumulated battlefield experience, gradually becoming one of the most talented military commanders in Egyptian history. This may have been a wise strategy to keep him occupied and away from the center of power, while maintaining military stability for the country. Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE, after more than 20 years of prosperous rule. We do not know exactly what she died of. The mummy identified by scientists as Hatshepsut in 2007, through a tooth that matched a tooth box bearing her name found in her tomb, shows that she died in her 50s. The research team's analysis also found signs of bone disease and possibly skin disease, potentially linked to a skin lotion she used that contained a harmful ingredient, but that was something she could not have known while alive. What she could know, in her final years, was that she had built a stable empire, a prosperous economy thanks to expeditions like Punt, and architectural monuments that would endure forever after her passing. What she could not know was what would happen to that legacy after she was gone. Thutmose III, the man to whom she had given military command and allowed to accumulate battlefield experience throughout 20 years of co-rule, now held all power alone, with no one left to share the throne. And around 20 years after Hatshepsut's death, a campaign began. Not a military campaign. This was a campaign to erase memory. Craftsmen were assigned to move through hundreds of monuments across Egypt, including the very temple of Deir el-Bahari she had been proudest of, to scrape away the image of Hatshepsut. Her face was smashed. Her name was gouged out of stone. Her great temple at Karnak was sealed behind new brick walls, hiding her magnificent obelisks from public view. The king lists recorded afterward completely omitted her name, jumping straight from Thutmose II to Thutmose III, as if her 20 years of rule had never existed. Why would someone she trusted enough to hand an entire army turn around and erase the very person who had built his power? Scholars have debated this question for over a century. Some argue that Thutmose III acted out of personal resentment, carrying suppressed anger from the years he lived under the shadow of the throne. But the evidence does not really support this theory. If this were personal revenge, why didn't Thutmose III erase Hatshepsut's memory immediately after her death, the moment power fell entirely into his hands? Instead, he waited nearly 20 years before beginning this campaign. And more importantly, inside her temple at Deir el-Bahari, the story of the Punt expedition and her divine origin was largely untouched. What was erased was mainly her public presence, the images in streets and temple courtyards, places ordinary people would see every day. The most persuasive theory today is that Thutmose III, or his son Amenhotep II, acted for reasons of systematic succession rather than personal emotion. By erasing a female pharaoh from the official record, they ensured that no woman in the future could use Hatshepsut as a precedent to claim the throne for herself. This was an act of long-term political prevention rather than the revenge of someone who had once been suppressed. And it very nearly succeeded. Very nearly. Chapter 8. It was not until 1822, when Jean-François Champollion deciphered hieroglyphic writing using the Rosetta Stone, that ancient Egyptian texts could be read again for the first time in over 1,000 years of silence. And as scholars gradually translated thousands of surviving texts on damaged walls, something strange began to happen. The name Hatshepsut appeared. Faint, obscured, partially erased but never completely gone. Exactly like what remained at Deir el-Bahari. The temple the erasure campaign never fully managed to reach. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, Egyptologists gradually pieced together the story of a pharaoh someone had deliberately tried to erase. In 1903, archaeologist Howard Carter, later far more famous for discovering the tomb of Tutankhamun, excavated a pit near the temple of Deir el-Bahari and found thousands of fragments. These were the remains of Hatshepsut's statues, deliberately smashed according to the very campaign Thutmose III had ordered centuries earlier, then buried like refuse. Over the following decades, those fragments were transported to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where experts patiently pieced them back together, as if restoring the very identity the ancients had once tried to destroy. And out of that wreckage, the face of Hatshepsut gradually emerged once more, calm, confident, resilient. Then, in 2007, archaeologist Zahi Hawass announced the results of an investigation that had taken years to complete. Using DNA analysis and tooth comparison with a tooth box found bearing her name, his team precisely identified the mummy of Hatshepsut among hundreds of unidentified mummies in the collection of the Cairo Museum. She was not lost. She had only been waiting for over 3,000 years to be called by her rightful name once again. Today, the Temple of Deir el-Bahari is one of the most visited sites in Egypt. Every year, millions of people from around the world walk up the steps of the temple that Hatshepsut herself, together with Senenmut, designed for herself more than 3 millennia ago. They look at the surviving reliefs, the Punt expedition, the story of her divine origin, the image of a pharaoh who spent her entire life asserting her place in a world she was once told had no room for her. Someone once tried to erase her from history with chisel and hammer. But history has its own way of preserving what deserves to be remembered. And Hatshepsut, Matkare, foremost of noble women, Pharaoh of Egypt, deserved to be remembered more than anything any chisel could ever erase. The story of Hatshepsut is not simply the story of a woman stepping into a world built by and for men. It is the story of a true leader who built her country through trade rather than war, through architecture rather than destruction, through long-term policy rather than fleeting glory. It is the story of a network of power built with extraordinary care. From a commoner like Senenmut to a nephew entrusted with command of the army, like Thutmose III, to stone walls carved to tell a story of legitimacy no one could dispute. And it is also a story about the resilience of memory, about how, no matter how hard someone tries, a truth carved deep enough into stone will never completely disappear. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment and let me know. And if you want to continue this journey into the mysteries of ancient Egypt, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for joining me tonight.